All right, welcome everybody to another session of Developer Hours. Today we're going to be talking about the Block Hooks API, and I'm joined by Bernie Reiter. And what I want to do is I want to give you a quick introduction to who we are, and I also want to share some relevant news in the WordPress ecosystem that might be relevant to you all and relevant to this discussion, since we're going to be talking about the Block Hooks API with new changes coming in WordPress 6.5. So to start, my name is Nick Diego, and I am a full-time sponsored contributor working on WordPress, specifically with developer relations, creating content like this, writing articles, that sort of thing. And Bernie, how about yourself?
Hi, my name is Bernie Reiter. I'm automatic sponsored contributor also to WordPress, working as a developer. I've been a co-committer for a little over a year and a half now. My recent focus are block hooks, and I'm super happy to talk about them today.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming on. We're lucky to have you here. So the biggest news that I wanted to share is that WordPress 6.5 has actually been delayed a week. So if you're watching this presentation, watching the recording after the fact, or reading the article that I will share in a minute, know that you should be using WordPress, the latest release candidate, so 6.3 RC, 6.5 RC3. But next Tuesday will be the official release of WordPress 6.5. There was a bit of delay around the fonts library to make sure things were in perfect shape before the release went out the door. So unfortunate that the release isn't coming out today as planned, but in many ways it's a great thing. So we can tidy up things before the rest of the world starts using 6.5. So the way that this presentation is going to work is we're actually going to follow an article that Bernie and I collaborated on, and I'm going to put it in the chat as a link. This article came out on the developer blog. If you're not already subscribed to the developer blog, I encourage you to do so. We publish about 2 articles a week, very developer focused, as the name of the blog would imply, and really trying to cover kind of the latest that's happening in WordPress, block hooks being one of them. So in this article, in the presentation that we're going to do today, we're going to kind of cover the basics of the block hooks API. And then I personally find the best way to learn is through example. So we're going to briefly explain, Bernie's going to briefly explain, why did this thing come about? What is it all about? And then we're just going to start diving into examples to see how it works and how you might be able to apply it to your own projects. So Bernie, would you mind starting just to share like why the block hooks API? Where did it come from? Why do we need it? What is it trying to solve?
Sure. It's basically trying to fill a gap or stretch an itch that we noticed existed with block themes. In classic themes, we have the concept of hooks, of like classic hooks that we are used to from WordPress codes to apply filters or actions to, and add those in our own code, in our extensions, in our plugins, to inject, for example, some content on the front end. And we became aware that that didn't really exist for block themes, at least not on the granularity of blocks. You could do this on an individual block level, but not really at a more global level. So we thought that the best way of transporting this concept into a block theme world would be to allow injecting blocks relative to another given block to determine a block as an anchor and inject the desired hook block next to it. And one basic tenet for all this was to make this work in an automatic way. So the moment you activate a plugin, this content would also be visible on the front end once a user visits it. Unlike blocks, which you would otherwise have to inject manually in the editor. So we did want plugins to be able to basically out of the box inject something on the front end.
Yeah, that's great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen, and then we can look at like a block theme and think about this more in context. So let me start sharing my screen here. Stop one. Okay, so you should see page with colorful pictures on it. This is just the default 2024 theme with a different homepage template applied. So what we're trying to do here is like, if we had a theme like this is your client's site, or anyone's site, and you wanted to say install a plugin that was like an e-commerce plugin, and maybe that e-commerce plugin has a menu item for like a shopping cart, like a cart button, or maybe an account button, something that in a block theme, the user traditionally would have to go into their navigation and add that block. How can you create a mechanism such that you remove that step of the user actually having to add it, and the block that's required for your plugin is automatically inserted? And so in this case, you would basically want to insert a block here that would be for the shopping cart. There are a lot of different use cases you can think of, so maybe you have some sort of custom plugin that introduces additional fields in the comments template for posts. It's really hard to come up with examples, but also easy at the same time. Like, it really depends on the use case of your plugin. So if you have a plugin that needs content in a specific place, you will immediately find uses for the Block Hooks API. And so what we're going to try and do today is just go through some abstract examples. We're not going to be working with any third-party plugins or anything. There are some custom plugins that we're going to be working with, but they were built for demonstration purposes. And hopefully that will give you some inspiration to think about how you could use the API in your own projects. Before we do that, let's just talk about basically the two ways that you can inject blocks into a block theme. And before I continue, I want to clarify something, is that we talk about injecting blocks. We are injecting blocks into templates, template parts, and patterns. The Block Hooks API, maybe there's a roadmap for this. I don't believe there is. Bernie, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You cannot inject blocks into post content. It's just templates, template parts, and patterns. Is that correct, Bernie?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so I'm going to cheat, and we're going to take a look at the article here. And there are two methods: block.json and hooked block types. Bernie, do you mind just sharing how the block.json approach works?
Yeah, sure. So as we touched upon, you will normally find a position or a location that you want to inject your block into, which is determined by a given block. As you were mentioning, for example, you want to inject the shopping cart block into your navigation block. So in that case, we call the navigation block the anchor block that describes the location you want to insert it to next to, and you have a relative position. As you have highlighted, that could be before that block, after the block, as its first or its last child. And the syntax for the block.json is exactly that. You basically add a new stanza called block hooks, a field that is a JS object with a key, which is the block ID, the block type name, and the relative position as its value. And if you insert the snippet into given blocks block.json, it will be injected after the post content, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so we'll look at this in more detail later, but this is a block plugin that Bernie created, and I'll actually share the link in the chat real quick for people to check out. So to see this in context, if we look in the source folder and we go to block.json, this is the complete block.json for this block. And you can see at the bottom, it has a block hook specification. In this case, it's hooking this like button block, which we'll see in a second, as the last child of the core comment template block. So if you're not familiar with this way of naming blocks, this is just the kind of the under the hood name for each block. And this would be your anchor block in this case, and last child would be the position. The second method is using the hooked block types filter. Actually, real quick, before we move on, you'll notice that there's nothing, all you can specify with block.json is the name of the block and the position. So we call this unconditional block hooking, hooked blocks. You basically can't determine at this point, we will show you some methods later, but you can't at this point to say anything about like only on single posts or, determining any other conditionals that would limit where this block is hooked. With this implementation, it would display after post content, or in the situation with the block, after the comment template as the last child for every comment template block in a template part or pattern. We'll see more conditional approaches in a second. And the second approach is using this hook block type feature filter, which does allow conditional hooking as well as unconditional. Anything you want to share about this filter, Bernie?
I think the unconditional one in block.json is great also to start experimenting if you want to try out block hooks. Just be prepared that wherever you have, in this case, a post content block, your hook block will show up. If you want to fine tune it a bit and make that limited to certain template types, then you will want to use the filter afterwards.
Exactly. So the filter is pretty straightforward. I hopefully many of you have used filters in the past. And this filter, again, is called hooked block types. And it accepts 4 parameters. One is this hooked block types, and it's an array of all the hooked blocks. It's saying hooked a lot. Then you have the relative position, like we said before, after. When you're working with PHP, just note that the syntax is a little bit different for first child, as opposed to in block.json, where it's like that. And this is, what is this called? Is this
I think this
snake
is
case?
snake case, isn't it?
Yeah.
The one's camel case, yeah.
Camel case versus snake case. And this is your anchor blocks, so very similar. You're determining where you want to anchor your block. And this is where you can start determining additional conditionals. And this is the context. So this will return the context of the anchor block. So in this case, if we wanted to hook the A block after post content's our anchor block, and the context will tell us some context about where this anchor block is. And that context can either be a template object, a post object, or an array if the anchor block is in a pattern. So it will be a template object if it's in a template or template part. It will be a post object if it is part of a navigation menu, and it will be an array if it is part of a pattern. So you can we'll explore context more in a second, but this is how you can employ additional conditionals to determine where your block is hooked. So this example code right here is basically replicating what the block.json approach did. This is an unconditional block hook where, because we're registering this filter, or we're implementing this filter, and this filter could be implemented anywhere. It doesn't need to be implemented in the block plugin at all. I could have that like button block plugin installed, and then I could have a utility plugin over here that's implementing this filter. You need to define the name of the block that you want to hook. Whereas in the case of the block.json file, that block.json file is in the block plugin itself. So it already knows the block that it's trying to hook. In this case, we could hook anything. So what we're saying is if the relative position is after, and if the anchor block type is that core post content, add our, in this case, example block to that hooked block types array, and then return the hooked block types array, and the block will be hooked on the front end. So real quick, I'm taking a peek at the chat here, and is this a substitute for using custom fields? No, I think, and Justin, thank you for answering that. This is not a replacement for custom fields. The block bindings API would be for that. This is more about hooking in blocks in different places, often third-party blocks, but we'll show some core blocks that we can do that with. Now,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just trying to add this is really strongly focused on the front end. So I think for
Mhm.
custom fields, you would normally want some way in WP admin to add some data, I think, to your post object or custom post type, which block hooks doesn't really tackle. So yeah,
Yeah.
but Binance is what do you want?
Before we move on, though, I think it's important at this point to mention some tenets of block hooks. Uh, Traditional hooks and filters, you're modifying the front end, and you didn't really care about the back end per se because people were just editing content in the classic editor, or even if they're editing content in the block editor, there was a separation of content. One of the key tenets of block hooks is that any block that is hooked will also appear in the site editor. And that's really important because it I don't know how to articulate this well enough, but the fact that not only are you hooking content on the front end, but you're also making it available in the site editor. You're doing what you want, you're hooking the block, but you're also giving the user full control over that hooked block. So for example, like let's say you register a plugin, it hooks in, keep going back to that shopping cart block, but then the user says, actually, I want it over here. They can go into the site editor and move it around in the navigation. So that's like an important concept around tenant of block hooks. And maybe that is you want to force your block exactly where you want it, no matter what the user wants. You can't do that with block hooks. The user will ultimately have full control over being able to go into the site editor and modify where that block lives. The idea behind block hooks, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Bernie, is to make it easier for your users because you're inserting the blocks for them, but they still have control ultimately where it lives. They could even remove it, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think one way to think about it is when you would have classic themes where you would use some illustrative filter to inject content. There's just not really any counterpart. We didn't have like visual theme editing in classic themes by and large, except for page builders.
Yeah.
But typically, in order to really modify your theme, you would go in and have to like edit the code.
Right.
Here, we just happen to have the site editor for block themes. So we have to take that into account. And the best way to take that into account in I think our opinion was that a plugin may well inject a block somewhere, but it should be the ultimately the user's decision to keep it there or move it around or dismiss it or tweak it to their liking, basically.
Yeah. So before we move on to a new filter or two filters that were implemented in 6.5, let's just see what this looks like. So what I'm going to do is if we come over here to this demo site, again, this is 2024. We look at our plugins. I have that like button block already installed. And the like button block does two things. It has the block hooks defined in block.json. And then it also defines another hook in the main file. And this is one of those, actually, this is a conditional hook, but we'll talk about conditional in a second. But this is implementing another hook after post content. So there's basically when this plugin is installed, it's hooking this like button in two places. One after post content on single posts, and then in the comment template. So if we come over here and we go to appearance, go to the editor, we go into templates and we go to single posts, you will see that here's this block that's been hooked. It's been hooked after post content, and it's been hooked as the last child of, let me open up the list view here. The last child of the comment template. You can see that right here. So it's after post content here, and it's after in the last child of the comment template. So this is This was not added by me. This was added purely by that plugin, by installing it and activating it using block hooks. And then if we go and check it out on the front end, we go to say here, we can see that we have the like button block here. And then if we go to comments and we see after the comment template, we see it again here. So that's what it looks like. And if I wanted to, as a user, after this plugin was installed, I could say, I don't really like that. I want to move it down here. I want to move it up here. I can do that, and I can just hit save, and I'm good to go. But the block hook eliminated the step of the user having to go find the block, find the block, insert it. The hook is taking that step and inserting it for you, and then you can have full control from there. Now, this is kind of, at this point, this is where 6.4 left block hooks, basically, with the two filters that were implemented. And you could do conditional stuff, which we'll talk about in a second, but basically this is where it left off. 6.5 adds a whole bunch of new cool features. And the first two, or one, and one's a variant of the other, filter is the ability to filter hooked blocks. Am I saying that right? Basically, you can modify the attributes of a block that has been hooked. Because if you'll notice, when we were looking at the like button here, and even the article here, we're just implementing the block. We're not defining attributes. We're not setting the color, font size, any of that kind of stuff. We're just implementing the default implementation of the block, no customization. The next filter, which is the hooked block, and then the hooked block underscore, and then you can define the block name. This allows you to then modify any hooked block.
Yeah. The idea was initially we wanted to capture as closely as possible or mimic the experience of a newly inserted block. Like you open your site editor, you open the block inspector there and insert a new block, which uses the default attributes. This is what the original requirements were, or the original idea, and we still recommend that people are judicious and pick the right default attributes that ideally work well when inserting a block as a hooked block. But it's been a very widely requested feature to also allow tweaking attributes and setting those. So we added that in 6.5.
Yeah, this is my favorite because it really introduces a lot of flexibility. And as I was experimenting and writing this article and talking with Bernie about like implementing examples, it really started to like open the door of like, wow, you can do so much with this hook. It's kind of unbelievable. So real quickly, it's gonna include the very similar parameters. You're gonna have the parsed hooked block, which is going to be your hooked block. It's going to have the hook block type, the relative position, the parsed anchor block, and context. Context, relative position, hooked block type, those are very straightforward. They're the name of the block, the relative position. Context is going to be the same as it was in the previous hook. The two differences here is this parsed hooked block, and it's actually an array, and it's a what's the correct terminology here? It is the parsed block array format for a block. Can you speak a little bit more about this? Because this is actually, it seems very minor, but this is actually a brand new format. It's not a new format, but it's a new format for extenders.
Yeah, it's true. It hasn't been exposed much. This is used during the block render pipeline, if you will. I think it has been maybe exposed in some fairly obscure filters, like in render block data. It's basically it allows Core to build a tree of blocks using this inner block stuff that it then recurses through as it renders the block tree or as it displays it in the editor. It's a bit obscure. You have a bunch of fields as you're highlighting here that specify for each block instance their name, attributes, and basically inner component blocks.
Yeah, and we'll see this in practice in one of our examples in a second. So that's a very brief overview, and it may feel like we kind of glossed over a lot. But I think that now let's dive into an example of we already have that linked, sorry, the like button. It's already representing its blocks here. But what I want to do is I want to create a brand new demo plugin, just a utility plugin that is going to use the hooked block types filter to modify where the like button is hooked. So if you think about it conceptually, we have our theme 2024, we have the like button block plugin installed, and then I'm going to install another plugin that is going to then hook the like button in a different spot using our block hooks. So what I'm going to do is I actually have this already, the code already written, but you can also check out the example here. What we're going to do is I'm going to come over here, and this is the code that's directly from the article, just in a bit more of a simple form. It's a simple plugin called Hooked Block Hooks Demo. And if I go take a peek at our website here, we can see that I have this little demo plugin installed. Now we're going to look at context. So if we take a peek at the like button block, we can see that it has this context section. What it is saying, and it looks like a lot, but if we just read it through, we're checking that context is an instance of the template object, WP underscore block underscore template. This basically is ensuring that the anchor block, which in our case is post content, is an inside of a template or a template part. Then we're making sure that it has a slug. And one of the things I strongly recommend when you're playing around with block hooks is just like echo print underscore r context, and you can see all the different options that are inside of context. Because anything that's inside of context, you can build a conditional out of. The conditionals in these examples are quite simple, but you can get really fancy with them. And then we're checking that the context is single. Now this is a pretty weak conditional because the single template, which is used for posts, is also used for a lot of other things. So if you had a custom post type that didn't have its own template, it would also appear on that custom post type. So you probably would want to build a stronger conditional in real life. But for example purposes, this works here. So as long as the anchor block, which in our case is post content, is part of a template, is part of the single template, then we want to hook our block. That's what's being done inside of the like button. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy the same thing. We want to do the exact same thing. But instead of putting it after post content, what I want to do is I want to position it above the post title. So we come and check out our page here. What I want to do is I want to hook the block right here. I don't want to put it here. I want to put it right here. So again, this is our post title block, and I want to position it before. So post titles are anchor, and I want to position it before. So if we come down here, we can see that we're making sure that the relative position is before, and that the anchor block is our core post title. And then we're adding the name of the block to our hooked block type. So this is the name of that custom block. And I'm going to undo this filter, save. Now I'm going to go check out the front end, and we're going to go to this single post, and you can see now the like button is there. And if we go to edit site, we can see it's there. So it's surprisingly simple, right? it just works. But now I want to take it a step further. And this is actually where you start to see some of the power of this, because if you right now, block hooks is brand new. Not that many people are implementing block hooks in the real world. But as time goes on, more and more plugins will start using block hooks to do things like this. So in my situation, I have my demo plugin, and the like button block is already installed. I don't want to mess with that plugin because pretend it was installed by a third party. Like pretend I didn't know Bernie and that's his plugin and I can't touch the plugin. But I don't want this like button to appear below post content. I can remove it using block hooks as well. Now, there's two ways you can remove it. I'm going to remove it using that new filter in 6.5, the hooked block filter. You can also remove it with the hooked block types filter as well, and I'll show you that in a second. But let's try and use the new filter just to try using and showing off the new stuff. So here is that hooked block filter. Now I could just use the hook block filter, but when you're just modifying a single block, I think it's easier to use the version where you pass in the block name. Then you don't have to add another conditional inside of the function, callback function, to check for the block name because you're only targeting that block name. But it could look like this. It could look like this, where it's just hook block, and then I check inside of the callback function for the block that I want to hook. This is a conditional that I copied from Bernie, as it's kind of a best practice to check if the parsed hook block has already been removed or suppressed by a previous filter. Is there anything to say about this, Bernie, in terms of best practice or?
I would include this since this is a probability that there could be another filter with a higher priority coming in before, and then you want to be prepared that this thing doesn't exist.
Yeah. So basically, in every example you see in the article and in this presentation that uses this hooked block filter, we're going to include this just as a kind of best practice because, as Bernie said, to make sure that the block was not, if it was already suppressed, then you just move on. What we're going to do here is we're going to say, if the parsed anchor block, the block name, again, remember, we talked about how this is no longer just the name of a block. It is actually an array that includes block name, inner content, inner blocks, and attributes. So we need to check for block name, which is part of that array. Is it equal to core post content? And if it is, return null. Now, I could add more conditionals here, but I know that the like button block hooks the like button after post content. So what I'm saying here is if there's another hook out there that's hooking it to post content, just remove the block entirely. If you had no idea of the relative position, then you might want to check for relative position as well. But in this case, I know that the anchor block is post content. I don't want it there. So if the anchor block is post content, return null. Now, I have set priority to 15 here because the default priority is 10 for filters. And in the like button, it is using 10. So I just set it to a higher priority to make sure that this filter comes after. So if we save this now, what should happen is that this will go away. And it's gone. So that is how we can use, we use the hook block types to hook our own block. And then we use the hooked block variation that's specific to that like button block. And we modified it. And in this case, we modified it by removing it. In the next example, we'll show you how to modify it by adding attributes and other cool stuff. This example, we did modified it by just simply removing it. You could have, of course, done the same thing inside of the hooked block types filter. And that's this example here. We could have checked that if the relative position was after and the anchor block type was post content, we could have looked through the array of all the hooked blocks and we could have made sure that none of them were set to the like button. So I took us on a roundabout way just to use the new filter, but you could have definitely done it with inside of the hooked block types filter as well to remove a block. But that very simple example demonstrates the various filters that you can use to hook blocks and how you can basically modify a third-party block with your own custom block that's also using block hooks. All right. I'm sure there's been a lot of questions, and I see that there's 18 comments in here. All right. Does manually removing the block, oh, this is a great one. This one's for you, Bernie. Does manually removing the block detach it from the Hooks API?
Yeah, in a way it does. So if you've been paying close attention, you've probably noticed that you actually want to let the API know not to kind of like override your changes. That's something we have to take into account here. So I think it's fair to say it does detach it from the BlockRoots API. The moment that you modify it in the editor, when Nick moves it around there, and you save it, it becomes part of the containing template in this case. And we store information that tells the BlockRoots mechanism not to override that, not to insert another instance of the block where the plugin tells it to, so we don't end up with two blocks when the user clearly wanted to move it around, or when the user even ended up deleting it. We don't want the BlockRoots API to stomp over that and insert another one.
Yes, as simple as this looks, it is very complicated. And I think Bernie's been fighting with this for a while. I included a link to the latest dev note from 6.5 that includes a lot of this very technical information underneath the hood for you to check out there. But it actually is pretty interesting. I think we can see this here. Can you see the attribute where it's let's see, where it says like hooked,
Oh, that
ignored
I didn't
hooked?
pay attention. If you've edited this one, you will need to edit it and save
Oh,
it to see it.
right.
Yeah, that's how it works under the hood. The moment you modify it and then save the template, if you now reload it, I think you still have to reload it in the editor to see it. Then it
Yeah.
will, yeah, here it is. So we chose the post title as the anchor block, and this is given now this metadata attribute that Nick is highlighting, which we call ignored hood block, and that was pretty exactly what I was teasing a moment ago, which is ignored means from the perspective of block hooks. It tells block hooks when rendering the front end, these are good. Ignore these. We know normally there's a plugin that would tell you to inject this in this position, but the user has already seen these, has moved this one around, or has done whatever with it. Really doesn't really matter. Please, for the purpose of blockers, ignore this. This is good. This has become part of the actual template. This is how it works under the hood.
Yeah, so this attribute is very important because without it, your hook would always override whatever the user did,
Yeah,
which is not one of the tenets of block hooks, which is why
exactly.
we
That's
don't want.
how we're kind of like preserving the tenant. But this is under the hood. As an standard, you don't really need to worry about this. This is what Blockworks does for you, setting this attribute and making sure it reflects the user's changes.
Mhm. And one thing to note here is that if you clear custom, I just did that. So if you clear, like this should be intuitive, but if I save this template, right, my block is here. But if I clear customizations, it goes back to wherever the hook is telling it to do. But hopefully that's intuitive, but I just wanted to show that as well. All right, as cool as that was, I think that I want to show a cooler example because this is one that really kind of got. I'll be candid. I've worked on with Bernie and kind of like following block hooks for a while now, and the inability to modify attributes was something that I really wanted to see in 6.5, and all the hard work that you all did to get it in 6.5 is just awesome because I'm going to show you now an example where what we're going to do here is we are going to imagine you have this, here's your homepage. What we're going to do is we're going to hook in a block that displays the copyright for the website. But the copyright block that we're inserting, by default, it just says copyright and has the date, but it has a bunch of settings and attributes that you can set that makes it more interesting and changes the font size, changes the color. So if I'm hooking in this block for 2024, for example, I want to specify those attributes to make it look a little bit better. So that's what the next example is going to be. And we're really going to not stress, but we're really going to use that hooked block filter to modify our hooked block. So let's start with the plugin that I'm going to use for this. This is actually a soft pitch for the developer documentation. So the plugin that we're using is the copyright date block. This is the same block that if you were to go to, I'll promote this here, to the official WordPress developer documentation in the block editor handbook, there's a quick start guide. This will scaffold the copyright date block for you. There's also a great tutorial on building your first block. You will build the copyright date block in this tutorial. So I highly encourage you, if you don't feel terribly comfortable with building the custom blocks, follow this tutorial and you'll build your very own copyright date block. But that's the block that we're going to use in this example. And let me just quickly show you what this looks like. We'll just go to a sample page. So our copyright date block looks like this by default. It just has the copyright and the current date. But then it has these settings here where you can show the starting year. We can set it to maybe 2019. And then I can change the text. Maybe we'll do something like that and we'll make it small. So there's all these settings that you can apply to the block. And these settings, if you're not familiar with this, come in the form of block attributes. So these are our attributes here. You can see it says fallback current year, show starting year, has all these elements, text color, font size. So what we want to do in this next example is we want to take this copyright date block, we want to hook it in to the footer template, and then we want to use the block hook filter to add these attributes to it. So instead of the default, not that, instead of the default, which looks like this, instead of the default like this, we want it to look like this with all those attributes applied. So the first thing that we're going to do is we need to hook the block. So this is kind of the first step always, is we're going to come down here and we're going to use the hooked block types filter to hook our create block copyright date block. And this is where context starts getting fun, for lack of a better word. Context is really important. And this is something that I think that is, if there's one thing that you get out of this conversation, it's that you need to be careful about context, but context is also one of the most powerful features that we have here. In block themes, generally we have patterns and templates and template parts. However, a lot of themes use patterns inside of templates. So real quick, this is an example of the 2024 theme. If we take a look at the footer template part, you can see that it's actually pulling in a pattern, one of the patterns. This pattern is pulling in the 2024 footer template. Sorry, this pattern is pulling in the 2024 footer pattern. And if we go to patterns, we can come down here and we can see that this is that footer. Now, this is important to note. And if you may, I'm sure not everybody has built a pattern before, so I want to reinforce this. Patterns have a bunch of different properties, and you can attach patterns to templates. And you can see here that we have this block types property, and it's set to core template part footer. Each one of these footer patterns has the same thing: block types, core template part footer. What this does is, if we go back to the home page here, and we come down here to our footer, you'll notice over here that I can replace this footer with all these different options. These different options are patterns, and they're coming from the theme. So for example, footer with colophon 3 columns, that is footer with colophon 3 columns. So that is, I don't want to get too far off course by talking about registering, how we register patterns, but this is a way that you can register patterns such that they're attached to template parts. Back to block hooks. When in this situation, I want to hook my copyright date block inside of footer content. That content could be a template part or a pattern. So you can see here that this first condition is seeing if if the context is an array. If it's an array, it means that it's a pattern. Then we want to know if the block types parameter is set. And we want, and the block types, again, which looks like this, it's this block types parameter. We want to see if that is set to core template part footer. If it is, then we want to hook our block. That will take care of the patterns. Next, we want to hook it in all footer template parts. Because even though, I know this is getting a little confusing, even though this footer template part is pulling in a pattern, as soon as a user saves this, so right now, this is just a pattern. I haven't made any modifications to it. So if I wanted to target this site title block inside of this footer template part, the context is actually a pattern. Because if you think about it, the footer template part is pulling in a pattern. That site title is inside of the pattern. So the context is a pattern. As soon as I'm a user and a user changes this and saves it, it's no longer a pattern anymore. It's just a modified template part, which means the context is the template part. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody there. There's a better explanation in the article, but it's very important because one of the biggest features in 6.5 with regards to block hooks is that block hooks now worked with modified templates and template parts. In 6.4, they did not. So even if this is modified by the user, when you activate your plugin with hooks, block hooks, it will still hook the block in. But if the user hasn't modified the footer, the context will, in this case, will be an array or a pattern. If they have modified it, it will be a template part. Again, there's a better explanation in the article, but you need to kind of account for both things when you're hooking blocks in more complicated scenarios, which is why I have both checked for here. So if it's a pattern and it's using that block types core template part footer, or it's actually a footer template part, then we implement that here. I also think that in the article, I changed this. I clarified this a little bit. So this is actually should be area. So when you register a template part, you define the footer area, header area. So areas, the code example in the article is a little bit clearer. Then what I want to do is I want to hook this copyright date block after the site title. Now, not every footer pattern and every footer template is going to include a site title, but a lot of them do. So in this case, I'm just going to hook it after site title. So what I want to do is I want it to appear right here. I'm not going to save this, but what I am going to do is I'm going to, okay, I've saved my filter. So now if I refresh, we go to the front end, we come down here, and here we go. We have our hooked block. Now we'll refresh the site editor. Now I showed you that okay, so we can see it's hooked here. But let's take a look at our patterns, and we go to our footer patterns. You will see that anywhere there is the site title, we have our hooked block. Site title, hooked block. Site title, hooked block. Site title, hooked block. Site title, hooked block. So not only do we hook it into the pattern, into the template part where we want it on the front end, it's also now available in all of our patterns. So we won't get too much into that in this in terms of like modifying patterns, but with block hooks, again, you can hook things into templates, template parts, and patterns, which is very powerful. All right. we've done the easy part, and that's hooking the block. Now let's modify it with those attributes that we saw when we were editing it in the site editor. So now I'm going to come down here and I am going to just turn this on. So again, we're going to use that hooked block variant that allows us to specify the name of the block, just a little bit easier. Again, we're going to check if it's null. And if it is, we're just going to return the parsed hook block. Now we want to start building the conditional. I actually don't need this. This is for testing. So what we're going to do is we're going to only update the attributes if the block is hooked after the site title. In this situation, that's the only place I've hooked it. But imagine that you hooked the copyright date in many places, but you only wanted to modify the attributes when it's in this one place. You would use this conditional. Now, that hooked block types post array format, whatever it's called, includes attributes. And the attributes is an array. So here what we're doing is we're passing the attributes that we want to apply to that block. So if we come back quickly here and we take a look at the code editor, we can see that we have our attributes. And now when you're building these representations for a hooked block, I always just go into the site editor and just build it. Just build what I want the end result to be, and then come in here and copy the attributes that I know that I need. It's hard to memorize things, you know. It's hard to know exactly what you need for these attributes. But I know that I need the starting year, and the show starting year, the starting year, type color, and font size. So I've just copied those attributes into here, and I'm passing those attributes to the block. And then I'm returning the updated parsed hook block. So now when I go to the front end and we refresh, we can see that that hook block is now, the attributes are updated. And the coolest thing about this is that when we come, let me refresh here. As you would expect, when we come to the site editor, we come down here, we can see, oh wait, we have our code editor on. We can see that the hook block is here and all the attributes are set. So we had that show starting year, the starting year of 2019. We have the text color set. We have the typography set. So as a user, I can come in here and say, actually, you know, I thank you for hooking this block here and making it gray. I actually want it to be red. They can make that change, save, go to the front end, and voila, it's red. So again, the user has complete control, but here we're modifying the attributes of the hook block. So I'll end my monologue there. Bernie, anything else you want to add or share about that approach?
I think you've covered it pretty greatly. It's lovely to see actually what's possible now with the ability to set attributes. And I think you've showcased really well. But it applies across different patterns in the preview, different template parts. Can't think of anything to add at this point.
Yeah. So we are almost out of time now, but I want to provide a little bit of a preview about how you could even take this further. This is not in the article, but it was something that I've been thinking about. Right now, we are modifying attributes, right? Well, another thing that's an attribute is a pattern slug. This is an attribute of the pattern block. So you could hook entire patterns into different places. You'd hook the pattern. So you'd come in here, you'd do this part, you'd hook the pattern, which is WP block / pattern. And then you use the hooked block filter to modify the attributes by passing the slug of whatever pattern you wanted, which is pretty neat. So you could not only just hook individual blocks, you could bundle them all up in a pattern and serve that pattern. The next example, which again, you can read more about in the article, which is really interesting, is the fact that you could hook static blocks and then pass the content into those static blocks. Probably doesn't make sense, but just real quick. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in a paragraph block. And by default, the paragraph block is empty, right? It's just an empty paragraph. Then what I'm going to do is and this looks like a lot here. I'm going to use the hook block. This is in the article, so you can read through it. I'm breezing through it here. But what we're going to do here is we're actually going to use another one of those properties from the parsed inner block array format. We're going to pass
Mouthful.
in, what is it?
That's a mouthful.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to pass in the HTML for that static block, which in this case, we're just going to create a link and it's going to say back to top. We're also passing in attributes for the font size and the alignment. And this gets really crazy. We can take that paragraph block and we can wrap it in a group block. So in this case, I'm wrapping it in a group block. I've given it some top margin. I'm using inner blocks and inner content. I mean, I don't expect you to understand all of this, but I just wanted to kind of highlight what is possible. So if I save this now, we can take a look at what this looks like on the front end. And I come here. Now we have this little back to top link that comes after post content. It jumps to the top of the page. So this is all hooked in, and if we look at it, it's a paragraph block wrapped in a group block that's got layout constrained and margin, all sorts of stuff. So you can actually do really cool things. And then the last thing I want to say, which is a small but very big feature of 6.5, is that you can now hook blocks into navigation menus. So this is something that you couldn't do in 6.4. And when I was talking about this earlier, when we were talking about context, actually not here, my apologies. It is here. When we were talking about the different places that you can apply context, we had the template object, we had the post object, and the array for patterns. This post object is for the WP navigation post type. And this is where you can hook blocks into navigation menus. And this is really powerful. This kind of accomplishes that objective of hooking that shopping cart into navigation. But to see a really quick example of this here, what we're going to do is we are going to hook imagine you have a website that has like the login, log out block, and you want to hook that into the navigation menu. So here what I'm doing is for context, I'm checking that it's part of post content, or sorry, yeah, post object, WP post. And I'm making sure that the post type is WP underscore navigation. And then I'm hooking this in as the last child of the navigation block. Pretty straightforward. This is an unconditional hook, so it's going to hook everywhere. But just to show you what this looks like, we'll save here, come back to our home page. Let's just go to the front end. So what I want to do is I want to hook my login, log out block right here, and we'll refresh. And there we go. Now we have log out. And if I log out, now we have login. So the cool thing about this is it's not just putting it next to the navigation block, it's actually part of it. We can see that it's all part of the navigation container. It's part of that actual block that we have here. And of course, now I need to log in. Just want to show one more thing as we're speeding through this. But if we go to our edit site, and this is where it's so powerful, and we go to navigation, heading navigation, we can see that the block is actually part of that navigation menu. If we look at this more cleanly, if we look here, we can look in the navigation. You can see here that it's actually part of the navigation menu. This was not possible before, and now it is, which is very cool. So that was an hour, and I think that we covered almost everything that there is about block hooks at a kind of a top level. But I think Bernie and I are very curious to see what people do with this. The functionality that we have now with the additional filters really allows you to do a ton. But the examples that I presented here today, even the examples in the documentation and the dev notes, they're fairly basic. And so we encourage people to really try it out, see how far you can push it, because maybe you can speak. I don't know if there's any future plans currently, Bernie, that you can share, but like this is kind of the beginning of the API.
We're always kind of like curious to get feedback because, as you noted earlier, between 6.4 and 6.5, we had a few like recurring requests that kind of help shape where we're going. right now, as we're just wrapping up the 6.5 cycle, we don't have a very established roadmap for 6.6 yet. It will depend really largely on what people will find, what kinds of use cases they need, and what things they find to be missing.
Yeah.
So do let us know.
So try it. Yeah. And so there's a couple resources. And they're all, if you want to check out the article, all the resources are in the article, but namely really pay close attention to the dev notes that were created. These are the kind of the technical overview of the API when it was introduced in 6.4 and then the updates in 6.5. And then just leave feedback on the dev note, leave feedback on the article, ping both of us in WordPress Slack, wherever. At the very end of the article, there's also, sorry for the scrolling, this is a very long article. There is a link to the tracking issue on GitHub where you can check out kind of the development of the Block Hooks API and also add issues there. So, well, I appreciate, Jennifer, you saying that I spoke slowly, but I think I felt like I was talking in my own minute. So if you have any additional questions, please reach out to us. Again, this is a relatively new API, and there's a lot of more that can be done with it. And also, we want to see what other people are doing with it. So yeah, anything else you wanted to share, Bernie?
Expect a new tracking issue in the next couple of days. Or the one you're linking to, I think, was the 6.5 one. We have to garden a bit and then triage what we have, and we'll have a new one to kind of like start setting the direction for future releases.
Awesome. All right, well, that will pretty much end our session today. Before you jump off and leave, I do want to share a session evaluation that we would love for folks to fill out. Not only will this evaluate this session, but it also will help us frame future sessions. So developer hours, we try and do about 2 a month, and through the rest of the year. And often we'll be talking about new APIs, new functionality in WordPress, some evergreen content like using React components in WordPress development, things like that. So I think that one of the next ones we're going to be talking about is April 9th. It has not been published yet, but it will be practical applications of the interactivity API. If you attended our previous session earlier this month around like the broad overview of the interactivity API, this will be a great follow-up with a really cool example. Then we're also going to be doing one on block bindings. Like there was some conversation in the chat about that. That's going to be at the end of the month. But if you have any other ideas on what you would like us to cover, by all means, please share. And again, thank you. And thank you, Bernie, for coming. Thank you for building the API and allowing us to do these cool things. And yeah, we will see you on the next one.
Thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for hosting, Nick.
Yeah. Have a great day, everyone.